The mountains above Missoula hold their snow until May, and they hold their secrets longer than that. A young woman drives north alone before sunrise, the highway empty, the sky not yet decided between dark and light. Her truck is old, her birthday is today. No one knows where she is going because no one knows to ask. By afternoon, the storm finds her first, Wividsa drops to nothing. The trail disappears under 8 inches of new snow. She is 3 miles from anywhere that exists on a map, moving on instinct and the last of the light, when she looks left at exactly the wrong moment, or exactly the right one. Something stands between the trees, something with straight lines. And straight lines are the one thing nature never makes by accident. She pushes the door open. Inside, carved into timber that has been standing since 1891, someone left a message not for history, for her. The morning of her 21st birthday, Sarah Mitchell woke up to the sound of her own breathing. That was it. That was the whole list of sounds in the world that cared she existed. The Ford F-150 smelled like old coffee, and the pine-scented air freshener she'd bought 3 weeks ago that had long since stopped smelling like anything. She was parked at the far end of a Sinclair station on the outskirts of Missoula, in the spot furthest from the lights, which was also the spot furthest from anyone noticing her. Old habit, the kind you developed when you spent 18 years learning that invisibility was sometimes the safest thing to be. October 14th. She knew before she looked at the phone. She always knew. It was the one day of the year her body clock refused to let her sleep past 5 in the morning, as if her nervous system had circled the date in red and refused to let her forget it, even when every other part of her wanted to. She lay on her side, staring at the back of the cab, at the small shelf she'd built from 2 planks and a pair of L-brackets, where 3 paperback survival guides and a dog-eared copy of a Montana Trail Atlas sat in a row. She'd read all of them, more than once. She found them easier to sleep with than people. The phone screen lit the ceiling a cold blue. October 14th, 5:08 a.m. No notifications. She set it face down and stared at the ceiling. 21. The age when, according to every movie she'd ever watched on a cracked library laptop, your life was supposed to be something. A college campus, probably, or a city apartment with friends who forgot to text you back but at least existed. A family dinner you dreaded but could count on. She pressed her palm flat against the ceiling of the cab, cold vinyl under her hand, and thought, somewhere out there is a version of this morning where someone woke up early to make me breakfast. She didn't let herself finish that thought. Instead, she sat up, pulled on the gray fleece she kept balled at her feet for warmth, and started the engine. Sarah Mitchell had been found before a door. Not discovered, not welcomed. Found, the way you found something that had been left out in weather, present, unclaimed, requiring a decision about what to do next. The door had belonged to the Billings Children's Shelter, and the night had been October, and she had been wrapped in a flannel blanket that was not warm enough for the temperature outside. No paperwork, no note, 2 initials embroidered on the blanket's corner in blue thread. SM. A woman named Patricia at the county office had given her a surname to go with those initials. And then Patricia had left for a different job 3 months later, and the name was the only thing that remained of that transaction. Sarah Mitchell. The name of someone who existed on paper and needed a place to exist in fact. She had occupied 7 such places over the following 18 years. Foster homes, each one a different experiment in what a family could mean when assembled from obligation and good intention, and the particular exhaustion of people who had taken on more than they'd accounted for. Some of those families had been genuinely kind, some had been present in body and elsewhere in every other way. One had been briefly, memorably, the closest thing she'd known to what the word home was supposed to mean, until the Garcias had a biological child of their own in her 3rd year with them, and the geometry of the household changed in a way nobody announced, but everyone understood. She had learned, early and thoroughly, the one lesson that repeated across all 7 homes, regardless of their specific character. People's capacity to stay was finite, and the finite part arrived without announcement, and the only protection against the pain of that arrival was to never fully unpack. She had become, by 21, very good at not fully unpacking. The truck was evidence of this. The shelf was evidence. The $417 in the bank account, and the $60 in cash, and the 3 shifts a week at Brandon's Grocery on Mullen Road. None of it assembled into anything that looked like a life someone was building, versus a life someone was maintaining at the lowest sustainable level. Maintenance was what she knew. Maintenance was survivable. Building implied a future you trusted enough to invest in, and trusting the future was the kind of risk she had not yet found a way to absorb without flinching. She knew this about herself with the flat, observational clarity of someone who had catalogued the fact and filed it, and was not currently in a position to do anything about it. The engine ran. The heater blew cold air that would eventually become warm air. Outside, the Sinclair station threw its yellow light across an empty lot, and a semi pulled in from the highway, and the driver climbed down and stretched his back and went inside without looking at the gold truck at the far end of the lot, which was exactly as Sarah had intended when she parked there. She watched him go in. Then she drove north, because the mountains were north, and the mountains were the one place she'd found, over the course of 21 years, that had never once made her feel like a problem requiring a solution. The Sinclair station had a diner attached to it, the kind with laminate wood paneling, and a coffee maker that had been running continuously since approximately 1987. Sarah went in because it was cold outside, and because the alternative was sitting in the truck, thinking about the phone screen and its absence of notifications until she could justify leaving. A woman behind the counter had silver hair cut close to her head, and the particular kind of face that had spent decades deciding not to be unkind. Her name tag said Beverly in faded capital letters. She poured coffee without being asked, set it on the counter, black, and the automatic grace of it. The simple act of someone anticipating what you needed and providing it before you had to ask. Landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to land. Any big plans today, hon? The question was innocent. Beverly had no idea what she was asking. She was the type of woman who asked everyone this question, who collected small pieces of other people's mornings out of genuine warmth, and she could not have known that the question she'd just placed on the counter beside the coffee was precisely the one Sarah had been quietly bracing against since 5 in the morning. 2 seconds. The sentence arrived fully formed, the way practiced things arrived, meeting up with some friends later, smooth, unbothered. The particular vocal texture of someone delivering a fact rather than constructing a lie, because it had been used enough times to stop feeling like one. Beverly smiled. Well, that's nice. Happy birthday, hon. Sarah looked up. Beverly was nodding at the phone sitting on the counter face up, the date still showing on the lock screen. Thank you, Sarah said. She meant it with the specific sincerity of someone receiving the only birthday acknowledgement they were going to get today, from a stranger, over a $2 cup of coffee. And the kindness of it landed in her chest in the wrong place, the tender place, the place that was not prepared for kindness, from a direction it couldn't lean on going forward. She turned the phone face down and looked out the window. A man had just pulled into the station in a blue pickup. He got out carrying a small paper bag from somewhere and went around to the passenger side and opened the door and handed the bag to a woman who took it and immediately opened it and laughed at whatever was inside. The kind of laugh that only happened when someone knew you well enough to know what would make you laugh before breakfast. The kind of laugh that required weeks or years of paying attention to another person as the ongoing project of your daily life. Sarah drank her coffee. She did not look at them again. She paid in cash and left $3 on the counter, which was 40% tip on a $2 cup of coffee, because Beverly had asked her a question and wished her a happy birthday, and those things deserved to cost something. She walked back out to the truck and Beverly had already turned to the next customer, which was exactly how the transaction was structured, which was fine, which was not a failure of Beverly's and not a condition of Sarah's, and simply the way things worked in the category of human contact that didn't continue past the point of completion. She sat in the truck for one breath with the engine off. Then she started it and drove north, following the highway out of Missoula into the foothills, while the sky lightened in the particular grudging way of an October morning in Montana, where the light arrived as if it had other places to be. She pulled off the highway onto a county road she half remembered from a drive she'd done in August. The road wound up into the foothills and narrowed progressively, without announcing that it was doing so, the pavement giving way to gravel at the 7-mile mark, and the gravel thinning to a suggestion of a path in the final mile and a half, until it stopped in a cleared area surrounded by tall ponderosa pines where someone had at some point knocked together a wooden post with a trailhead marker. The marker said Trail 7B. Below it, smaller, unimproved, no services. Users proceed at own risk. She had been here once before, July. The trail climbed through mixed conifer forest for about 4 miles, broke into a brief meadow with a view across the Cascade foothills, then curved back down in a long loop that took most of a day. she'd done it alone, and come back feeling like she'd spent the day in a place that had no record of her failures, which was the closest thing she had to a vacation. She parked and cut the engine and looked at the sky before she got out. The sky was pale and uniform, not the sharp blue of a clear October morning. Something softer, almost white at the edges. She noted it the way she noted things that might matter later, with attention rather than alarm, and filed it and got out of the truck and started pulling on her hiking boots. Her pack was already assembled. She checked it anyway, because checking it was the habit, and the habit was the product of reading about the specific difference between people who survived bad situations and people who didn't, and that reading had been done at night, in a series of parking lots, over 2 years, and she was not going to uninvest in it now. Water filter and 2 full bottles, emergency bivvy, foil-backed, rated to 30 below. First aid kit with the actual contents rather than the store brand placeholder kits that had bandages and nothing else. Fire starter rod and striker and waterproof matches in a sealed tube she'd carried for 2 years without using. Paracord. Fixed blade knife in a sheath on her belt. Headlamp with 2 spare sets of batteries. 2 protein bars and a bag of trail mix. The paper trail map folded to the relevant section and zipped into the front pocket. A space blanket. She locked the truck out of habit rather than necessity. There was no one within 4 miles to break into it, and started up the trail. The first 2 hours were everything she'd come for. The trail climbed steadily through ponderosa and lodgepole pine, the forest floor carpeted in early fallen needles and brittle leaves from the aspen near the creek crossings. The air smelled like cold earth and pine resin, and the particular mineral quality of mountain cold that was different from city cold, in the way that all things were different when they hadn't been filtered through concrete and exhaust. Her breath made small clouds. The only sounds were her boots on the trail, and occasionally, from somewhere in the high canopy, a chickadee announcing its presence in the particular insistent way chickadees had in October, as if making the point before the forest went entirely quiet for winter. She thought about nothing in particular. That was the point. That was the entire reason for being here rather than in the parking lot at the far end of the Sinclair station. Not about Beverly, whose kindness had landed in exactly the wrong spot to be comfortable. Not about the man with the paper bag and the woman who laughed before breakfast. Not about the fact that somewhere in Montana or somewhere in the country there was very likely a woman who had once wrapped a newborn in a flannel blanket and left her at the door of the Billings Children's Shelter on a night in October 21 years ago, and that woman was doing something today, anything, something ordinary, and had absolutely no awareness of what day it was for her possible daughter. Sarah didn't think about any of that. She walked. By early afternoon she'd covered about 3 miles, and stopped at a boulder near a creek, crossing to eat one of the protein bars and check the map. The trail looked right. According to the map, she had another 1.5 miles before the meadow, then the loop curved west and south back toward the trailhead. Back at the truck by 5, maybe 5:30, before full dark, she didn't notice the sky changing until she'd already started moving again. That was the thing about weather systems that moved through the Cascades in October. They didn't give notice. They arrived the way death arrived, gradually and then all at once, and by the time you registered the shift you were already inside what it had become. The pale sky she'd noted at the trailhead had gone a darker and more purposeful gray, without her marking the transition. The light had changed quality, flatter, more diffuse. The chickadee had gone silent. She looked up through the canopy. The clouds were low and moving, not the fast-moving fragmented clouds of a wind event. Heavy clouds, the stacked pressing kind that had been building somewhere over the Bitterroot all morning, while she was drinking coffee at a laminate counter and not looking at the horizon. She checked her phone. No service. She'd known there was no service. She opened the weather app by reflex anyway. It loaded a cached screen from 2 days prior, partly cloudy, high of 52. The actual temperature was somewhere around 38 degrees and dropping. She folded the map back into the pocket and started moving faster. The first snowflake landed on the back of her hand at 2:47 p.m. She noted the time, noted the wind direction, which had shifted from southwest to northwest in the past 20 minutes, noted the way the daylight was failing faster than it should for a mid-October afternoon at this latitude, noted the way the forest had gone from quiet to completely, absolutely silent, not the quiet of an ordinary afternoon, but the held-breath silence of a landscape that knew what was about to happen and had already made its preparations. 1 flake, then 3, then more, Within 10 minutes, the snow was coming down steadily through the canopy, fat wet flakes that clung to the needles and turned the trail surface from brown to white in long uneven patches. Within 20 minutes, visibility had dropped to 30 feet, and the trail itself had become hypothetical, a direction more than a defined path. Within 30, she was standing at a fork in the trail that should not have existed because the map showed no fork at this point. Looking at two options that both presented themselves with equal credibility, and neither of them offered any way of being verified, she stood still, panic. All three of those survival guides had explained with the particular urgency of people who had thought about nothing else for years. Was not an emotion. It was a physiological cascade. Cortisol and adrenaline flooding a system that redirected its entire energy budget to threat response and left nothing for spatial reasoning, nothing for the careful sequential thinking that was the only mechanism actually capable of getting you out of a situation like this one. Panic was the brain executing exactly the wrong program with exactly the wrong resources at exactly the wrong time. She breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. She looked at the fork. She looked at the map and turned it in her hands and tried to match the terrain to the topographic lines. But the snow was changing the contours, filling the low spots, softening the ridgelines she'd been using as reference points for the past 3 miles, and the flat gray light made everything appear the same distance away regardless of its actual position in space. She chose the right fork, walked 20 minutes. The trail narrowed to nothing and the trees pressed closer, and nothing in front of her looked like the meadow she was looking for. She turned around, went back, tried the left fork, walked 15 minutes. The trail curved in a direction that felt wrong, not wrong like she was certain, wrong like the low, quiet voice in the back of her chest that had learned over 21 years of navigating unreliable situations to be right about these things, was saying, without drama, that this was not the direction she needed. She stopped, and thought the thing she'd been actively not thinking for the past 40 minutes. I might actually be lost, not dramatizing it, not catastrophizing. Just the flat, plain statement of a fact that had become unavoidable, settling in the way the snow was settling, quietly and continuously and without asking permission. She was off the marked trail. The light was going. The temperature was dropping. She was alone. No one knew exactly where she was. The truck was at a trailhead she had not logged with anyone, because there was no one to log it with. She thought about how long it would take for someone to notice. She ran the calculation. Beverly at the Sinclair station didn't know her name. Her boss at Brandon's grocery expected her Thursday, which was 2 days away. There was no roommate, no family member, no person who would register her absence as a problem before Thursday morning, and even then, the problem would be a missed shift, rather than a missing person. And the escalation from missed shift to search and rescue was a chain with many links, and each one required someone to decide it was their responsibility to pull it. She pressed the thought down with deliberate effort and replaced it with the only category of thought that was useful now: find shelter, generate heat, stay put or navigate with maximum caution. 3 things. That order, she kept moving. An hour passed, maybe more. Time had gone unreliable in the way it did when all available cognitive resources were committed to the immediate physical problem of moving through terrain that was actively working against that movement. The snow was not lightening. The flakes had gotten smaller and faster, the physics of them shifting in the way that happened when the temperature dropped below the threshold, where fat, wet snow became dry, driving snow. And her jacket was working, but working at capacity, and the exposed skin of her face had transitioned from cold to numb. Sometime around the same moment, the last useful light drained out of the sky. She was moving on a downslope. That was deliberate. Elevation was the enemy in this kind of weather event. Lower ground meant more natural shelter, more likelihood of water nearby if she had to make a camp, and if the storm was tracking from the northwest, then an east-facing hillside below the ridgeline offered a degree of protection from the wind that she could not get in the open. She had run through her options approximately 16 times in the past hour and arrived at the same inventory each time. She could make an emergency camp. She had everything required: the bivvy and the fire starter, and the map of how to use them that she'd built from the survival guides and had never needed to consult in practice until now. She could survive a night in these woods, in these conditions. She knew that. The guides were explicit about it, and she believed the guides. She just didn't want to, not because she feared the cold. Because she had spent 21 years being someone who had nowhere particular to be and no one waiting for her, and the thought of spending her 21st birthday alone in a snowstorm in the middle of a Montana forest. Not because she had chosen it, but because she had run out of alternatives, was a summary of her life so precise and so unsparing that something about it was almost funny, and the almost funny part was what hurt most. She kept walking downslope, the slope leveled. The trees thinned slightly in the ambiguous way that sometimes meant a clearing ahead, and sometimes just meant the character of the forest had changed. She pushed through a dense stand of young lodgepoles, growing in the close-packed way they grew after a disturbance. Their branches interlocked at head height and came out into a narrow space between two large mature ponderosas. She stopped, looked left, and there, in the space between two old trees and the hillside rising behind them, half buried under 30 years of accumulated needlefall and the first active hour of new snow, partly obscured by the branch of a standing dead pine that had fallen against its near wall at some point in the past decade, was a shape that did not belong in a forest. Straight lines, two corners meeting at 90-degree angles, a plane of weathered gray wood rising from the forest floor in a configuration that was recognizably, unmistakably, deliberately constructed. Her brain processed it in the sequence that brains used for genuine surprise, first as wrongness, as a visual anomaly that didn't parse, and then as recognition, and then as something that didn't have a name yet but carried weight, a wall, a roof, a structure. She moved toward it through the new snow, and with each step more detail resolved out of the gray. The width of the thing, wider than it had looked at first, maybe 12 feet across. The walls wide-cut timber planks rather than the round logs of a traditional cabin construction, which was unusual and suggested a particular origin for the material. The way the whole structure was elevated slightly, on a low platform of stacked flat stones that had been selected and placed with intention, and underneath the decades of moss and weather and leaf rot that had softened every surface, just barely visible along the base of the structure if you were looking for it, the rounded ends of something enormous beneath the raised floor. Curved wood, massive curved wood, still bearing along its outer arcs the ghost of iron hardware that had gone entirely orange-brown but maintained its shape. Still describing, if you knew what you were looking at, the circumference of something that had once rolled. Those were wagon wheels. Not a wagon anymore. The spokes were long since collapsed into the earth, the wooden components rotted away, only the iron rims maintaining their arc. But someone had stopped a wagon here, or a wagon had stopped itself here, by braking, by running out of road, by some version of an ending that had been the beginning of something else, and had built a house on top of it. Not a temporary structure, a permanent one. With the specific craftsmanship of someone who intended it to count, who joined the boards with care, and set the roof with the correct pitch, and built the stove platform from flat stones selected for flatness. She stood in the falling snow and looked at this impossible, ordinary thing, and felt something shift in her chest. Some small movement in the specific weight she carried everywhere, always, so consistently that she had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the weight of your own clothes. She did not yet have words for what moved. The closest she could come, standing in the dark at the edge of an October snowstorm on her 21st birthday, was hope, which was unexpected, which she set aside to think about later. She moved toward the door. The steps were 3 flat stones worn smooth at their centers in the particular way that only accumulated use produced. Dozens of footfalls over years, each one leaving an imperceptible contribution to the rounding. The door was heavy board and batten construction, with iron hardware that had oxidized to rust orange across most of its surface, except where someone had oiled the hinges, not recently but within the decade, the oil having darkened the metal in the specific pattern of deliberate application. She put her hand on the latch, stopped for one breath. She had stood at the doors of 7 houses in her life, with the specific quality of not knowing that came before those thresholds. She had learned in the process of those 7 to read the feeling without inhabiting it, to move through it as a procedural matter rather than an emotional one. Detach, enter, assess. This did not feel like any of those 7 doors. This felt, and she registered this as potentially a symptom of the cold, which could do things to cognition. Like standing outside something that already knew her. Like a door that was not waiting to decide but had already decided, and was simply waiting for her to arrive at the same conclusion. She pressed the latch and put her shoulder into the door. The hinges gave with a sound that was more musical than it had any right to be. Resistance, then release. The door opened inward. The air that met her was cold but still, dry and sealed. the passive cold of a space protected from the weather, rather than the active cold that had been working on her body for the past 2 hours. That distinction was not small. That distinction was the entire difference between the situation she had been in and the situation she was now in, and she felt the shift of it in her body before her mind had time to process it. She stepped inside, pulled, the door closed behind her. The darkness was complete until she got the headlamp out and clicked it on, and then the space assembled itself in the beam. Small, 8 feet wide by 12 deep roughly, which was the footprint of a large wagon expanded slightly by the walls built around and above it, a bench along the left wall, wide enough to sit on or lie on, 3 shelves on the right wall, the wood gray with age and dry, a few tins on the top shelf whose labels had long since gone, an empty hook worn deep where something heavy had hung for years. At the far end, a bunk frame built into the corner, wooden slats warped but intact, and at the near left wall, centered on a base of flat stacked stones, occupying the room the way a fireplace occupied a proper house, meaning with authority, a cast iron stove, small, pot-bellied, the old style, with a firebox door, and a vent handle and a pipe rising from the crown, through a fitted collar in the ceiling. The iron was the deep, unreflective black of metal that had processed a great many fires over a long time. She crouched in front of it and put both hands flat on the iron. Cold. Completely cold. But not the cold of abandonment, not the cold of something broken or given up. The waiting cold of a thing that knew what it was for and had not forgotten. She looked at the base. The stone platform was clean, or clean in the sense of having been swept at some point with intention. A fine layer of dust on the surface, but no debris, no leaves, no the kind of accumulated neglect that appeared when a space had been sealed and left. Someone had cared about the condition of this stove, had treated it as a thing that needed to be in working order, rather than a relic in a space that no longer had a purpose. She moved the headlamp and found the wall, carved directly into the timber beside the vent pipe, cut with a blade to a depth that meant it would last, practical lettering with no attention to aesthetics. Keep lower vent open during storms. Below it, same hand, dry pine catches fastest. Check east pipe if smoke backs. She read them twice. This was not sentiment. This was instruction left by someone who understood that the next person through this door would be cold and unable to afford the time required to learn by trial and error. Someone who had stood here and thought, I know something that the next person will need, and I should make sure they have it. And below those 2 lines, in different lettering, sharper cuts, more recent, the work of a blade that had not aged as long, 3 additional words with 2 initials, still works. KH. She stared at those 2 initials for a moment, then she unshouldered her pack and began. The lower vent was exactly where it should be. She opened it, checked the firebox. Thin layer of old ash, nothing blocking the grate. Found the east pipe access on the wall she'd identified as east, by orienting herself from the hillside to the north. Checked the cover, found it clear. Behind the stove in the gap between it and the timber wall. A stack of split pine, bone dry, the kind of dry that came from years of sealed storage rather than recent seasoning. Below the split wood, thin strips of bark set aside for kindling, with the purposeful organization of someone who had done this many times and left the setup ready for the next use. She pulled the fire kit from the outer pocket of her pack. First strike produced sparks and a brief smolder in the tinder that died. Second strike, better. Third caught and held, and she fed the small flame to the bark strips and moved them carefully into the firebox. And placed the bark against the face of the smallest piece of split pine. Smoke moved the wrong direction for 5 seconds, pushing back into the room, and she held her hand against the vent handle, and waited with the particular quality of attention that had no room in it for anything except what was happening in the firebox right now. Then the draft found the pipe. The smoke moved up. The fire found the pine, and the pine found the fire, and neither one let go. She sat back on her heels and watched the orange light grow in the firebox opening, and felt the first thread of heat reach her face, and she laughed, a short involuntary sound, because relief sometimes had no other available expression. Because she was 21 years old, and alone in a snowstorm in a structure built on wagon wheels, and the fire was working, and she was going to survive the night, and those facts together were more than she could hold in silence. She peeled off the outer wet gloves, and held her bare hands toward the growing warmth and let them hurt as sensation returned. She was warm enough, by the time she found the drawer, to feel things that were not strictly related to survival. That was the threshold. Cold narrowed everything to itself, left no processing capacity for anything except the immediate physical problem. but warmth reopened the range of available experience, and she found herself actually seeing the room rather than just cataloging its emergency relevance. The worn hook, the particular way the floorboards had been fitted, each plank meeting its neighbor with a precision that spoke of someone who understood that a gap was not a cosmetic problem in a Montana winter. The marks on the walls at child height, barely legible now, that might have been drawings made with something that had long since faded to near invisibility. She was looking at those marks, head tilted, trying to determine what she was seeing, when her hand shifted on the bench surface, and the sound changed under her palm. Hollow, a clean resonance where solid timber should have been. She pressed again, same location, and got the same answer. She worked her fingers under the front edge of the bench seat and moved them along the underside until she found the loop. Small, metal, dark with age, absolutely solid. She pulled. A drawer slid out from the body of the bench, on runners that had been built by someone who knew what they were doing, moving straight and true, with only the resistance of wood that had not moved in a long time, and it traveled to the end of its range and stopped with the quiet authority of a thing that had been designed to do exactly this. Inside was a bundle. Olive-drab canvas, the heavy surplus kind, cut down and folded carefully around its contents, and secured with a length of leather cord that had darkened and stiffened with age but held. The bundle had been wrapped with care, not haphazardly, with the care of someone protecting something they considered worth protecting, for a time they could not predict, for a person they could not identify. Sarah looked at the bundle for a long time, without touching it. The storm pressed the walls. The fire settled into its established rhythm. The pipe conducted its low drone. She thought about KH and the two words above the stove. Whoever had carved those had thought about the next person. Whoever had wrapped this bundle had also thought about the next person. This place had a history of people preparing for a future they would not inhabit, leaving provisions for a stranger they would never meet. She untied the leather cord. The canvas opened in 4 panels. Inside were letters. Many letters, 20 or 30 at least, folded sheets of paper in various sizes, yellowed to the amber of old paper in good conditions, each one folded and stacked with a care that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with the intention to preserve. The stack was not bound or banded, just placed, one on top of another, in a sequence that had its own logic even if she couldn't read it yet. Just stacked and preserved. And hidden under a bench in a cabin in the middle of a Montana forest in a snowstorm on the 14th of October. Sarah's hands were very still. She thought, whoever hid these meant for them to be found. The alternative was burning them, leaving them in the open to rot, disposing of them before leaving. Hiding them with care was not an act of concealment. It was an act of preservation for a future that was by definition unknown. She lifted the first letter and unfolded it. The handwriting was large and plain, each letter formed with a slight deliberateness suggesting a writer who had learned without formal instruction and had found their own form through practice. The ink faded to a brown, so dark it was nearly copper in the headlamp. No greeting, no salutation. A date at the top, December 3rd. No year's snow came 2 days early this year. Roof held through the night. Clara was scared of the sound. Told her it was just the mountain talking. She said mountains don't talk. I said she hasn't listened long enough. Sarah sat completely still. She read it again. The name landed with a weight that surprised her. Clara. Not a historical category. Not a type. A specific child, frightened by a specific sound on a specific night, who had been given a specific answer by a specific person, who had thought about how to address fear in a way that didn't dismiss it. She turned to the next letter. Outside the storm worked on the cabin with everything it had. Inside the fire held, and the headlamp held, and the letters waited in a stack that had been waiting for a long time, and Sarah Mitchell, who had spent 21 years moving through the world as someone without a past worth investigating, or a place worth returning to, read her way into a history that had no reason to include her, and somehow, impossibly, felt like it already had. The letters were not in chronological order. She determined this. Around midnight, after she'd read enough of them to start mapping the family against the seasons they described, and realized the Thomas who wrote about the East Slope collapsing in March was writing with less fluency than the Thomas who wrote about the February roof repair, which meant the stack had been sorted by someone's last handling of them rather than by their original sequence. The edges of the papers carried the evidence of repeated contact, softened at the folds in the specific way that only happened when hands had returned to the same creases many times, reading and rereading over years. She reordered them by the apparent age of the handwriting and the seasons they described and the progression of Clara's age, which she could trace through the references. The child who couldn't reach the high shelf, then the child who drew mountains. His phone never stopped ringing. Then the young woman who asked questions that her father couldn't immediately answer. By the time she'd established the rough sequence, she had a dozen letters on each side of what felt like the middle period, and it was the middle ones she stayed with. The ones written when Thomas Holt had stopped being afraid of the mountain and had not yet arrived at whatever came after that. The ones written when Clara was old enough for opinions and young enough to voice them without the editing that came with age. She read one letter twice. Clara spent most of the afternoon at the south window. Said she was drawing the mountain. I looked at the paper when she set it down to eat. It didn't look like a mountain. It looked like a woman lying on her back with her arms folded across her chest. I didn't say anything. Some things a person draws before they know what they're drawing. Sarah set it down and looked at the faded marks on the wall at child height, the ones she'd been trying to read since she came in. She looked at them for a moment with a different understanding. Then she picked up the next letter. Through the accumulating sequence of Thomas Holt's spare accountings, the family arrived at specificity. Mary, whose name appeared with the frequency of someone present at every significant moment, even when the letter was nominally about something else, who had made cornbread from half the available flour one winter and placed it on the table without comment and been recorded by her husband as simply the kind of woman she was. Clara, who upon being told that they lived far from town, because the land here was honest, had thought about it for a moment and said that maybe the land was honest because nobody had lied to it yet, and whose father had written that he had not known what to say to that. Thomas himself, who had come from Nebraska in 1887 because the alternative was staying, who had found himself on this mountain not by ambition but by accident, the wagon's axle giving way in country he hadn't expected to stop in, winter arriving before he had options, the decision to build on top of the wagon rather than abandon it being less a decision than the only remaining move. He had written, in the middle of his letters, "We did not choose this mountain. The mountain chose us. I used to think that was a defeat. Now I think it might have been a gift." Sarah read that line and looked at the wall above the stove and thought about what it meant to begin somewhere you hadn't planned and build something true out of it anyway. She held that thought and then moved to the next letter. The one with the October 14th date was in the middle of the sequence, which meant she reached it somewhere around 2 in the morning, when the fire had settled into a low, steady output and the storm outside had shifted from urgent to persistent. The kind of snow that had stopped announcing itself and simply continued. She saw the date at the top before she registered its significance. October 14th. Her eyes passed over it and continued to the first line and then came back. She looked at her phone. The clock read 2:11 a.m. October 15th now, technically, but the 14th had been the day. The day she'd woken up in the truck and driven north and walked into the storm and not walked back out. She looked at the letter. Today Clara turns 8. We had very little to spare this year, less than last and less than the year before, but Mary saved dried apples since September, putting aside 2 or 3 from every batch we processed, keeping them in the blue tin on the high shelf that Clara cannot reach. She made a small pie this morning, just enough for 1 slice each, and Clara's slice was larger than mine or Mary's, though neither of them said so. Clara said it was the best pie she'd ever had. I think maybe it was, not because of the apples, because of what it cost to make it, and because making it was the choice we made with what we had. Sarah stopped breathing. She read it again, slowly. Then again, because of what it cost to make it. Not expensive in money. Expensive in the other currency, the one that was actually scarce. Sustained attention, quiet preparation, the weeks of setting aside 2 or 3 apples from every batch, the commitment to a future moment before that moment existed. Mary Holt had thought about Clara's birthday before Clara's birthday arrived. She had not waited for the day to decide it deserved something. She had decided in September and worked forward from that decision, the love not in the pie itself, but in the weeks of small daily acts that made the pie possible. Sarah looked at the wall and the stove, and the carved instructions and the warm air, and the letter in her hands, and felt something give way in the center of her chest, with the quiet authority of something that had been under pressure for a very long time, and had finally encountered a reason to release. She did not attempt to stop it. She had developed over 21 years an extremely reliable mechanism for redirecting this type of response before it fully arrived. A kind of emotional sleight of hand in which you acknowledged the thing and moved past it at speed, sufficient to prevent it from settling. She had used this mechanism many times, and in various conditions, and it had always worked because she had always applied it immediately, without hesitation, because hesitation was how the thing got through. She did not apply it now. The tears reached the page before she registered them. She moved the letter to a safe angle and let herself cry in the quiet, private way she'd learned, without noise, without performance, without the complicated hope of being witnessed. She was crying because Mary Holt had saved dried apples in a blue tin on a high shelf, and it had happened and it was real, and it had been real for Clara in 1891 in this room, and its having been real then meant it was not a category of thing that existed only for other people. It was available in the world. It had existed here. The evidence was in her hands. She sat with that understanding for a long time after the tears had stopped. Near the bottom of the stack, she found the letter that was different. In a way she identified immediately from the paper, thicker, heavier stock, the kind selected when you intended the thing to last beyond the conditions in which it had been written. The folding was more deliberate, the crease lines crisper, the whole thing handled with a different quality of intention than the others. It had been placed at the bottom of the stack, which meant it was either the first or the last thing Thomas Holt had written in this place. And the handwriting had the ease of someone who had been doing this for years and had stopped thinking about the act itself. No date at the top, just, if someone finds this one day, Sarah's hands went still. Then the cabin has done what I built it to do. It has kept someone safe through a night they were not sure they would survive. That is all I ever built it to do. And if it has done that, then it has been worth every hour of the work, and every nail I set wrong and pulled and reset, and worth the first winter we spent here before the walls were finished, and the cold came through every gap, and Mary said nothing about the cold, though she must have felt it more than she let on. We did not build this place to be remembered. I want to say that plainly, because sometimes people do things as hoping the thing will make them permanent, and I do not think permanence is something a person can earn by building a structure. We built this because winter was coming, and our daughter needed a roof, and we had a wagon and hands, and some knowledge of what wood did in different weather, and that was the entirety of what we had. But if you are reading this, then something we made has outlasted us. And that is not nothing. That is, in fact, the thing I find myself most grateful for when I think about what I am leaving behind, which surprises me, because I expected to be most grateful for the years or the land or the life itself. And those are not the things I think about. I do not know who you are. I do not know what year it is where you are standing, or what brought you to this mountain on this particular day. But I know that you needed this place. You needed it to be here, and to be standing, and to have a stove that worked and dry wood beside it, and instructions left by someone who understood that the next person through that door would be cold, and not in a condition to learn by experiment. So let me tell you the one thing I learned from 10 winters in this place, which is the one thing I wish someone had told me before the first once winter. The hardest winters are not the ones with the most snow. They are the ones you go through alone. Build something that lasts, not for yourself. For the person who comes after you, they will be a stranger and you will be a stranger to them, and that will not matter at all. What will matter is whether you left the thing in a condition to be used. Carry it forward. Thomas Holt, October 1891. The fire made a small sound, a settling in the wood, an adjustment. Sarah held the letter and did not move for a long time. Carry it forward. Not remember us, not preserve us, not even understand us. Just take what was built and continue what it was built for. Keep the warmth moving through the chain of people who thought about the next person, who left the instructions, who oiled the hinges, who stacked the dry wood, who prepared the space for someone they would never meet. She thought about KH and the 3 words above the stove. Still works. 2 initials and a date and a statement that said, I was here and I checked, and you can trust it. Someone had stood in this room, possibly not long ago, and had assessed it and found it adequate and had left that finding for whoever came next. She understood something then that she had not understood before she came into this room, or had understood only in the abstract way that didn't change anything. The opposite of forgotten was not famous. The opposite of forgotten was tended. This place had been tended by Thomas Holt and by whoever KH was, and possibly by others between them, and tending was the thing that mattered. Not recognition, not record, not the presence of any audience at all. She also understood. The letters were not safe here long-term. The cabin had survived 130 years through a combination of good construction and good fortune and the deliberate attention of at least one person who kept checking on it, and none of those three things was guaranteed to continue. She had found this place by accident in a snowstorm, which meant the finding of it was not controlled, which meant anyone could find it by any number of other paths, and the letters deserved better than continued luck. She carefully replaced them in the canvas bundle, retied the leather cord, placed the bundle in her pack. She turned her attention to the floor, near the base of the bench, where the planks met the timber frame. One section of flooring had a grain pattern that ran slightly differently from its neighbors, and a seam that had been planed to near invisibility, but remained detectable to a hand pressed flat against it. She pressed down. The panel shifted slightly. She lifted it. A small tin, sealed around its lid with dried sealant that had gone hard and brown with age. She worked the lid carefully and it released, inside, a silver dollar dated 1889. A photograph small enough to fit in a palm, the image faded to near illegibility but still showing three figures. Tall, shorter, small, standing before the outline of a wagon in a landscape of open hills and high sky. Their faces too faded to read but their arrangement legible, the way a family arranged itself for a photograph. And beneath both of those, a piece of paper heavier and more formal than the letters, with printed text and handwritten entries, and a series of official markings along its margins. She held it under the headlamp and read it twice to make sure she understood what she was holding. A land filing. Original issue. Thomas Holt. October 1888. The parcel in the Cascade Ridge area of Missoula County, where she was currently sitting in a structure built on wagon wheels, in a snowstorm on her 21st birthday. She did not yet know exactly what it meant in terms of what would come next. She knew it was significant in ways that extended beyond the historical. She rewrapped everything in the canvas, secured the pack, and set it beside the stove. She slept after that in the functional way of a body banking what it needed, and woke twice to feed the stove, and returned to sleep each time with the ease of someone who was warm and no longer in immediate danger, which was still remarkable compared to where she'd been 6 hours earlier. Before first light she was up. She banked the remaining coals, restacked the wood box from what was left of the dry pine, straightened the bench. She stood in the center of the room for a long moment and looked at it. The empty drawer, the stove, the bunk, the marks on the wall at the height of a child's hand. She was taking the letters and the tin. She was entirely certain of this, and she was certain it was the right thing to do in the same way she was certain about very few things. Not because certainty came easily to her, but because this certainty did not feel like a decision. It felt like recognition. Thomas Holt had written his letter to whoever found it. She had found it. The obligation that created was not abstract. She shouldered the pack and stepped out into the morning. The storm had finished its work sometime before dawn, and left behind the profound stillness that only followed a heavy snowfall, a quiet so complete it had physical texture. 10 inches on the ground at least, more in the drifts along the north-facing slopes. The sky had gone from storm gray to high thin overcast, the kind that diffused the early light to a uniform white glow that made the snow appear to generate its own illumination. She stood on the stone steps for a moment and looked at the cabin. In the daylight, under snow, it was different than it had been in the storm. Older looking, more settled into the hillside. The wagon wheel arcs at the base caught the white light in long curves. The timber walls had the specific gray of old growth, well joined and well kept. The roofline was clean and true, no sag, just the low pitch of someone who had understood what a Montana winter would put on a roof and had built accordingly. She stood there longer than she needed to. She was aware that she might never see it again. She was aware that it had been here for 130 years without her and would likely continue to stand regardless of what she did or didn't do, or would not, depending on variables entirely outside her control. She was aware that she had walked in here, cold and lost and frightened, in a way she hadn't fully acknowledged until now that the danger had passed, and she was walking out warm and purposeful, and carrying something that had been waiting, for exactly as long as it needed to wait. She turned from the cabin and started through the snow. The hike out was twice as slow as it should have been. Fresh snow over unfamiliar terrain was its own specific difficulty. Every flat surface a potential hazard concealing either a hole or a frozen creek bed beneath its uniform white cover. She navigated by compass and terrain logic, keeping the ridgeline to her north and working the downslope, crossing 2 creeks, icing at their edges, pushing through young lodgepole stands that dumped snow down her collar. She was fully committed to the ground in front of her when she saw the tracks. 2 sets of boot prints in the new snow. Made after the storm ended, after first light within the past 2 hours at most. 1 set large, the stride long and deliberate, the tread pattern of serious backcountry boots. 1 set smaller, both sets coming from the northeast. Crossing the clearing she was moving through, continuing in the direction of the slope she'd come down, in the direction of the cabin. She stood very still and looked at the tracks, and understood a series of things in sequence. Someone knew this place. Someone had been here recently, possibly regularly. The dry wood in the box and the oiled hinges and the KH above the stove were not the work of a single visit long ago. They were the evidence of ongoing attention, continued maintenance. A person or people who had been keeping this place in condition for reasons of their own that she did not yet understand. She left the tracks alone and kept moving south. 2 miles further on she found a defined connecting trail that intersected Trail 7B and followed 7B south to the trailhead. She was 40 minutes from the truck when she came around a bend and nearly walked into a man coming the other way. He stopped. She stopped. 6 feet of snow-bright air between them. Dark green jacket with an agency patch on the shoulder. Wide brim hat with snow on the crown. Radio on his belt, mid-40s. The particular physical ease of someone who spent most of his working hours in terrain like this and had stopped distinguishing it from ordinary. He looked at her. His eyes moved across her pack, her condition, her face. Sarah Mitchell? The fine hair on her arms lifted under her layers. How do you know my name? Your truck is at the 7B trailhead. Ran the plates this morning when I checked the area after the storm. He held out his hand. Kenneth Holt, DNRC, Cascade Ridge Station. I've been looking for you. She took his hand. Let go. Holt K. She looked at him. The initials above the stove, the newer carving below the old instructions. Still works, Kate, she said. The words came out before she'd decided on them. Just 2 letters. His initials. The inscription she'd read by headlamp while the storm pressed the walls. Kenneth Holt went very still. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he looked past her, toward the slope she'd come down, toward the trees that stood between him and the thing he already knew was there. You found it, he said. Not a question, she nodded once. A silence moved between them, not uncomfortable, the silence of 2 people standing in fresh snow on a mountain, while something shifted in the shape of the situation they were both now inside. My mother is going to want to meet you, Kenneth said. His voice was steady, and carried something underneath the steadiness that she couldn't yet name. She would come to understand it later, as the specific quality of a person receiving news they had spent a long time not quite hoping for. She followed him out of the forest. The truck was where she'd left it, snow-covered, ice on the windshield, the Pueblo gold paint turned nearly white under the morning's light. She sat in the driver's seat, while Kenneth stood outside on the radio with his station, letting them know the situation was resolved. She looked at the pack on the passenger seat, at the edge of the canvas bundle visible at the top, and thought about Thomas Holt writing in October 1891 to a person he would never meet, in a cabin he built from a wagon that had stopped somewhere he hadn't planned to stop, on a mountain that had chosen him rather than the other way around. She thought about what it meant to address the future directly, without knowing whether it was listening. She started the engine. The heater came on. The windshield began to clear. She pulled out of the trailhead and followed the county road south toward the highway, and the mountains were behind her, and the city was ahead of her. And she was carrying something that had been waiting for exactly the right person for 133 years, and the particular quality of that morning's light, flat and white, and full of what the storm had left, felt like the beginning of a thing she did not yet have a name for but recognized, the way you recognized a place you had never been, but had somehow always been moving toward. 3 days after the storm, Sarah sat at a kitchen table she had never sat at before, in a house on the east side of Missoula that smelled like coffee and old books, and the particular warmth of a place that had been lived in carefully over a long time. Dorothy Holt set 2 cups on the table and sat down across from her. She was small and precise, 67, with silver hair and the quality of attention that was the most valuable thing Sarah had encountered in a long time. Not the assessing attention of someone building a file on you. Not the careful attention of someone deciding how much to invest. The straightforward attention of someone who had decided you were worth listening to and was now listening. Her hands, when she'd shaken Sarah's at the door, had been dry and warm and entirely confident. The hands of a woman who had arrived at 67 by making decisions rather than having them made for her. She looked at Sarah the way almost no one looked at Sarah, which was directly and without the overlay of narrative. No pity in it, no assessment of what category of person this was, and what that category implied about how the conversation should go. Just, you are here, and I am here, and something brought you to my door, and I want to know what it was. Kenneth told me where he found you, Dorothy said. He told me where you'd been, what you'd found. She paused, both hands around her cup. He didn't tell me much else. He thought you should tell me yourself. Sarah looked at the canvas bundle on the table between them. She had kept it in her pack for 3 days, not because she was uncertain about bringing it here. She had known she was bringing it here since the moment Kenneth said his mother's name, but because she had needed 3 days with it before she could hand it to someone else. 3 days of carrying it in the pack, of taking it out at night in the truck and holding it and putting it back. 3 days of understanding what she was holding before she gave it to the people it belonged to. She looked at Dorothy. Thomas Holt was your family, she asked. Great-great-grandfather-in-law. Dorothy's eyes moved to the bundle and stayed there. My husband Hector's family. Hector passed in 2003. He spent most of his adult life looking for those letters. He knew they existed because his grandmother Clara mentioned them once when he was a young man. Told him she'd left something in the cabin before she came to Missoula. He looked for years, never found it. Sarah placed both hands flat on the table, one on each side of the bundle. They weren't lost, she said. They were waiting. Dorothy looked at her then with an expression that had several components, and none of them was surprise. It was the expression of someone who had suspected something and had not been willing to say it out loud, because she was a practical woman, and practical women did not say things like that until someone else said them first and made it permissible. She reached across the table and untied the leather cord herself. Sarah let her. Dorothy unfolded the canvas with the care of someone who understood fragility in the larger sense, not just in paper but in anything that had traveled a long distance through time and deserved to be handled accordingly. She lifted the first letter and opened it, and her face in the kitchen light was entirely still, and her eyes moved across the lines of Thomas Holt's handwriting, at the pace of someone reading something important rather than skimming it, and Sarah watched her and said nothing. After a long moment, Dorothy set the letter down and pressed her palm flat over it, the same gesture Sarah had made in the cabin 3 nights ago. The same instinct, the same need to establish contact with the thing, rather than merely possess it. There's something else, Sarah said quietly. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and set the small tin on the table beside the letters. Dorothy looked at it. At the oxidized lid and the ring of dried sealant, Hector's grandmother left a tin, Dorothy said, the words coming from somewhere distant. She told him once. Said she put things in it so they would stay. Sarah opened the tin and placed its contents on the table one at a time. The silver dollar, the photograph, and last the document, which she set in front of Dorothy without comment and waited while Dorothy picked it up and held it under the kitchen light and read the fine print along its margins. Dorothy went very still. Do you know what this is? Sarah asked. Dorothy set it down slowly, with the deliberateness of someone managing the implications of a thing before releasing it into the open air of the room. This is the original land filing, Dorothy said. For the Cascade Ridge parcel. The quarter section that includes, she stopped. The cabin, Sarah said. Dorothy looked across the table at her, with the full weight of her attention, which was considerable, the look of a woman recalculating the shape of a situation she'd thought she understood. We've been unable to establish clear title for 30 years, Dorothy said. The original filing was never updated, and the parcel number changed in the county reassessment of 1974. And without the original document, we had no way to prove continuous family ownership. There is a man in Bozeman who has spent the last 9 years arguing that the land is unclaimed public territory available for private acquisition, Sarah said. Ronald Webb. Dorothy's eyes sharpened. Kenneth mentioned him to me, Sisha said. On the way out of the forest, Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street. The refrigerator made its small sound. The kitchen was warm in the accumulated way of a space that had been lived in for a long time by someone who valued warmth. There's a county hearing, Dorothy said finally. 12 days from now. Webb's attorney filed a motion last month. We were going to attend with what we had, which was testimony and family history and nothing that constituted legal evidence. She looked at the certificate on the table. This changes that Sarah thought about Thomas Holt writing in October 1891 to a person he would never meet. She thought about the specific faith required to address the future directly, to write the letter and place it in the drawer and nail the drawer into the bench, and trust the decades to do what decades did with things that had been built carefully and maintained with intention. "Tell me about the hearing," Sarah said. Dorothy looked at her for a moment. Then she reached for the coffee pot and refilled both cups without asking, which was the gesture of someone who had decided this conversation was not going to be short and was not going to be one-directional and was not going to end at the point where the useful business concluded. Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm cup in the kitchen of a woman she had known for 40 minutes. In a house she had never been in before, on the east side of a city she had been living at the margins of for 2 years. She felt something she had no previous experience with and therefore no precise vocabulary for. The closest she could come was this: the sensation of a space arranging itself around you, not dramatically, not with announcement. The way warmth worked in a cold room, which was not by arrival but by the patient, continuous filling of what had been empty. The county hearing was held in a room that smelled like industrial carpet and the accumulated weight of decisions that hadn't gone well for someone. Room 114 of the Missoula County Administrative Building had fluorescent lighting and stackable chair and a folding table at the front, where the hearing officer, a man named Garrett, sat with a laptop and a legal pad, and the particular equilibrium of someone who processed disputes about land and easements 40 hours a week, and had developed a professional steadiness around outcomes that would have unsettled a person with less exposure. The walls were the color of old cream. A clock on the far wall had a second hand that skipped. Sarah had been in rooms like this before. Different rooms, same furniture, same institutional neutrality designed to process people rather than know them. She was not going to let this room do what rooms like this had always done to her, which was make her feel like a file rather than a person. She sat at the left table with Dorothy on one side and Kenneth on the other and the canvas bundle in front of her, and she kept her back straight and her hands flat on the table and looked at the hearing officer directly. Ronald Webb's attorney was a woman named Harriet Voss. 40s, efficient, with the particular confidence of someone who had read every document in the case and had arrived at her conclusion before the first word was spoken. She had a tablet and a printed brief with color-coded tabs and the manner of someone who did not expect to be surprised. Ronald Webb himself sat one chair back from Voss, slightly behind her, which Sarah registered and held. A man who sent his attorney to the table first was either very certain or not certain enough. And Voss did not look like the kind of lawyer who worked for a man who was very certain. Webb was 50s, silver-haired, well-dressed in the careful rather than conspicuous way. He had the face of someone who had spent decades assessing things, their condition, their value, their potential, and he was applying that same attention to Sarah now with a quality she couldn't immediately read. She held his gaze until Garrett called the room to order. Voss was thorough. She laid out the history of the parcel, approximately 40 acres of mixed conifer in the Cascade Ridge area, unincorporated Missoula County, accessed only by unmaintained roads and unmarked trails. She cited the 1974 county reassessment that had altered parcel numbers across the ridge area. She cited the absence of any deed transfer on record since the 1888 filing. She cited 3 legal precedents for adverse possession and unclaimed land reversion in Montana. She presented an aerial survey conducted at her client's expense in 2021, confirming no improvements visible from above, no maintained access road, no evidence of active occupation. She did not know about the cabin. Sarah could see that in the smooth efficiency of the presentation, the absence of any hedge or qualification in the section about the land's condition. Voss had built her case on information that was accurate as far as it went and had not gone far enough. When Voss finished, Garrett looked at the left table. "We have 3 items," Dorothy said. "The last one will take a moment to explain." Garrett nodded. Dorothy placed the 1888 land certificate on the table and turned it to face Garrett, who put his reading glasses on and leaned forward. The room went quiet in the specific way. It went quiet when something was about to change the shape of what had already been said. "This is the original filing," Dorothy said. "Thomas Holt, October 12, 1888. The parcel number predates the 1974 reassessment." She slid a second document across the table. "We have verification from the county recorder's office confirming that this parcel number maps to the same physical coordinates as the parcel currently under dispute." Voss's eyes went to the certificate. Something shifted in her face. Not alarm. The more contained expression of a careful person recalibrating. "Where did this document come from?" Garrett asked, looking at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at Sarah. And Sarah, who had spent 21 years being invisible in rooms like this one, who had learned that the way to survive institutions was to give them nothing personal to use against you, took a breath and told the truth, not all of it. The essential architecture, the storm, the trail, the structure she'd found in the dark, the drawer under the bench, the tin under the floor, the letters from Thomas Holt, the certificate. She and Dorothy had sat at the kitchen table 2 nights ago and decided together that the story mattered as much as the document, because a document without a story was just paper, and this particular story was the reason the document had survived long enough to be here. The room was very quiet when she finished. Garrett had taken his glasses off. He was looking at her with an expression that had moved past procedural into something more human. Vost did not object or interrupt. She sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the certificate, with the expression of a professional absorbing new information and deciding what it meant for the structure she'd built. Webb, behind her, had his eyes on Sarah. She looked at him when she finished. He was not the face she'd spent the past 10 days constructing. She had built, in the absence of direct information, a version of Ronald Webb that was simpler than the man in the chair. The version she'd built was motivation without complexity. Someone who wanted a thing and pursued it without sufficient attention to what stood in the way. The man looking at her from across the room had several things in his face, and at least one of them was something that looked like recognition, though of what she could not yet say. She held his gaze. Garrett put his glasses back on and looked at the certificate again. "I'm going to take a 15-minute recess," he said. In the hallway, Kenneth bought 3 coffees from a machine that dispensed them in small paper cups. Dorothy held hers without drinking. Kenneth finished his in 2 swallows. Sarah held hers and looked at the closed door to room 114 and thought about Voss in there right now reassessing her brief, and Garrett making his notes, and Webb sitting with whatever was in his face. He knew, Sarah said. Kenneth looked at her, about the cabin. He knew it was there. She kept her eyes on the door. The way he looked at me when I described finding it, that wasn't surprise. Dorothy sipped her coffee. He's had surveyors on that land. Surveyors who said there were no improvements visible from the air, Sarah said. Which means either they didn't find it or they found it and didn't report it. Kenneth was quiet for a moment. The cabin's built into the hillside. From directly above it reads as ground cover. You'd have to be standing on the slope to see it. Sarah thought about that. About the specific quality of the cabin's integration into its terrain. The moss on the walls, the fallen branch leaning against the near face, the way the hillside had grown around it, over decades until the structure and the mountain were difficult to separate visually from any angle that wasn't direct and close. He knew something was there, she said. He just didn't know what. The door to room 114 opened. Garrett's decision took 4 minutes to read aloud. The original 1888 certificate, cross-referenced with county records, and confirmed by the parcel mapping provided, established continuous family filing on the land in question. The 1974 reassessment had altered the parcel number, but had not extinguished the original claim. Webb's argument for adverse possession required a showing that the land had been genuinely abandoned without any evidence of use or maintenance for a period exceeding the statutory minimum. The documents and testimony presented suggested otherwise. Motion denied. Voss accepted it without visible reaction, and was already gathering her materials with the efficient movements of someone who had already moved to the next item on her professional calendar. Webb stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Dorothy and gave her a small nod, the acknowledgement of one person to another across a dispute that had concluded. Then he looked at Sarah. She was already looking at him. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he walked out. 2 weeks after the hearing, a padded envelope arrived at Dorothy's house addressed to Sarah. Dorothy had given Webb's assistant the address, which meant Dorothy had expected this, which meant Dorothy understood something about Ronald Webb that Sarah had not yet had time to learn. Sarah opened the envelope at Dorothy's kitchen table, with Dorothy sitting across from her doing something else, or doing a credible impression of doing something else, giving Sarah the space of misdirected attention. Inside was a single sheet of paper in a plain white envelope, the handwriting of a man who did not write letters often. The pen had pressed too hard on the first line and eased in the lines that followed, the way writing went when you weren't sure what you were beginning, and became more certain as you continued. Miss Mitchell, I've collected objects for 30 years. Furniture, documents, tools, photographs. The material evidence of lives that would otherwise disappear completely. I believe that what gets saved matters. I've seen too much loss through neglect or ignorance to be comfortable leaving important things to chance. The Cascade Ridge parcel came to my attention in 2015. I knew from the land records that something unusual had happened on that land, a filing that had never been updated, a property that had simply gone quiet for over a century. I had my people survey it. They found nothing that registered as a structure. I assumed whatever had been there was gone. I was wrong about what was there, and I was wrong about the approach. The correct way to protect something is not to own it. I've been in this business long enough to know that, and still managed to forget it. You reminded me. I've made a call to the Montana Historical Society. I've told them that a private citizen will be contacting them about a significant find in the Cascade Ridge area, and that the find deserves full preservation consideration. I've told them she is credible and should be taken seriously. I don't need acknowledgement. I just thought you should know the call was made. R. Webb. Sarah set the letter down and looked at the window. Dorothy, who had not been reading her book for the past 3 minutes, said, "Well?" Sarah slid the letter across the table. Dorothy read it. She made no expression that Sarah could isolate as a single identifiable thing. "He made the call," Sarah said, "to the Historical Society." "I know." Dorothy set the letter down and returned it across the table. "I also called them. 3 days ago." Sarah looked at her. "2 calls are better than 1, Dorothy said, in the tone of a woman who had lived 67 years, understanding that outcomes were not delivered by hope alone. Sarah looked at the letter in her hands. She thought about Ronald Webb, sitting in the county hearing behind his attorney, watching her describe finding the cabin in the dark, watching her place the certificate on the table. She thought about the quality of his expression that she hadn't been able to read at the time and could now name more precisely. It was the expression of a person recognizing that they had been wrong in a specific way and absorbing that recognition without deflecting it. Doing the wrong thing for the right reason was still doing the wrong thing. She understood that, but recognizing it and acting on the recognition was its own kind of correctness, and it deserved its own kind of acknowledgement, even if the acknowledgement was only in her own mind. She cared about that place, Webb had written. He'd spent 9 years trying to acquire it, which was the wrong method entirely, but it had come from a real thing. A real concern about what happened to significant places when no one was paying attention. She had no patience for the method, and she could acknowledge the origin and hold both things at the same time. That was not a contradiction. That was just the way people were. She put the letter in the inner pocket of her jacket, finished her coffee, went home, and started returning the emails from the Montana Historical Society that had been arriving for the past week. The historian who came from Helena was named Dr. Patricia Marsh, and she walked into the Cascade Ridge Forest in late November with a team of 4, and the particular energy of someone who had spent a professional life being told that things were probably not as significant as reported, and had cultivated optimism as a professional reflex. She was right to have cultivated it. Sarah led them in. The snow from October had melted and refrozen and melted again, and the forest in late November was a different environment than the one she'd walked into in the storm. Harder, barer, the understory stripped to its skeleton, every branch visible against the low gray sky. The cabin, when it emerged through the trees, looked older in this light, not deteriorated, more deeply embedded in its place, more clearly a thing that had decided to stay. Marsh stopped walking when she saw it. She turned to the younger man beside her with a field recorder and said something Sarah couldn't hear from where she was standing. He wrote something in his notebook. Then Marsh walked forward with the careful steps of someone who understood they were approaching something irreplaceable, and she stood before the cabin's door and put her hands on her hips and looked at the structure from its base to its roofline, taking her time with each section, and she said quietly, in the tone of a person for whom professional language was temporarily insufficient, "Good God." She turned to Sarah. "How did you find this?" Sarah gave the short version. Storm, disorientation, darkness, straight lines. Marsh looked at her for a moment. "You were looking for it." "No," Sarah said. "I was just cold." Marsh looked back at the cabin. "Same thing sometimes," she said, and went to examine the walls. The team spent 4 hours at the cabin that first day. Marsh moved through it with the systematic attention of someone who had done this many times and had learned to see what was there rather than what she expected to find, which was a harder skill than it sounded. She noted the construction method, the timber joining, the stone platform under the stove, the specific type of cast iron in the firebox. She noted the carved instructions on the wall and photographed them from multiple angles. She noted the empty drawer under the bench and the panel in the floor where the tin had been, and she noted these things without requiring an explanation of how they came to be empty, because Sarah had sent ahead a detailed account of what she'd found and what she'd taken and where it now was. On the way back out through the forest, walking behind Marsh in the afternoon's thin light, Sarah heard the historian say to the young man beside her, "This is the most intact example of immigrant wagon conversion architecture in the state, possibly in the region, and it's in near-perfect structural condition. Why didn't it collapse?" the young man asked. Marsh was quiet for a moment. "Someone kept it up," she said. They emerged from the tree line and walked back to the vehicles. His phone never stopped ringing, and Marsh shook Sarah's hand with both of hers and said that she would be in contact within the week. And Sarah drove back to Missoula, with the heater running and the mountains behind her, and the particular quality of the afternoon settling around her, the specific feeling of having done the right thing, and having the right thing confirmed as such by someone qualified to confirm it. She stopped at Dorothy's on the way home. Dorothy poured coffee before Sarah had her jacket off. They sat at the kitchen table, and Sarah described the day, and Dorothy listened with the same quality of attention she always brought to these conversations, which was the attention of someone for whom the story was not second-hand but personal, not history but inheritance, not information but the continued arrival of something she had been waiting for without being certain it would come. When Sarah finished, Dorothy looked at the window for a moment. "Hector would have walked every mile of that with you," she said. Her voice was level, the particular levelness of someone who had carried a grief for long enough that it had changed its form, not disappeared but become something that could be spoken rather than only felt. Sarah looked at the table. "I know," she said, though she hadn't known Hector and couldn't know precisely what that would have looked like. She said it because it was true in the way that mattered, which was not the factual way but the human way, the way of recognizing what something meant to someone and acknowledging it. Dorothy picked up her cup. "Tell Dr. Marsh that the letters are available for review whenever she needs them," Dorothy said. "Tell her I have photographs, too, from when Hector was young. Clara sent him photographs once when he was in his 20s. He kept them in a folder in the desk in the study. I know exactly where they are." Sarah wrote that down in the small notebook she had started keeping for exactly this kind of detail, the kind that would matter later and be impossible to reconstruct if you didn't capture it when it arrived. The months that followed were not the clean forward motion of a story that knew its destination. They were the irregular, frequently interrupted motion of a preservation process, which involved documentation and structural assessment and legal filings and committee meetings and budget discussions, and a substantial amount of waiting in between each of those things, the waiting its own kind of work, in that it required patience, applied as an active rather than passive effort. There were 3 separate occasions on which Sarah sat in an institutional room and listened to people explain, with the careful language of people whose professional lives required them to deal in contingency, that full museum relocation was a complicated undertaking, and timelines could not be guaranteed. She did not lose patience in those meetings. She had Dorothy beside her in most of them, and Dorothy's presence was its own argument, because Dorothy brought to every bureaucratic obstacle the particular quality of a woman who had been waiting her entire married life for something to become possible and was not going to accept further deferral now that the possibility had arrived. Kenneth attended fewer meetings because his schedule was the forest, which operated on its own calendar with no regard for committee timelines. But he drove Sarah out to the cabin twice during the winter to check on its condition. They went on snowshoes the second time, in February, when the accumulation was too deep for boots, and stood inside the cold room and looked at the empty drawer and the stove and the marks on the wall at the height of a child's hand, and said nothing for a long time, because the room didn't need filling. On the way back to the trucks that February afternoon, Kenneth said, "She drew on those walls when she was young. Clara, my grandmother's grandmother. Family story was that she drew the mountain because she was afraid of it. And her father told her that drawing something was how you decided it couldn't scare you anymore. Sarah walked behind him in the snowshoe tracks he'd already made. "Did it work?" she asked. He looked back over his shoulder, squinting slightly in the white light off the snow. "She lived here until she was 19, he said. Then she went to Missoula and became a school teacher and never came back." He turned forward again. "I think it worked." Sarah watched his back moving through the trees and thought about a girl drawing a mountain that looked like a woman lying down, and a father who looked at the drawing and said nothing, and a mountain that stayed where it was, while Clara went north to become whatever a woman became when she had decided the thing that frightened her had run out of the right to do so. She thought about that for a long time on the drive back. In March, Judith Crane at the Montana Historical Society called with a timeline that had moved from contingent to committed. Full relocation of the Holt cabin structure to the Missoula Heritage Museum was approved for late spring. A preservation team from Bozeman had been contracted. The museum had designated gallery space. Opening was projected for late September. Dorothy, when Sarah called to tell her, was quiet for a moment before she spoke. "Hector knew it was out there," she said, "his whole life. He just couldn't find it." She said it without grief, or with the kind of grief that had been living with a person long enough to become something else. Something more like acknowledgement, the piece of a thing that had finally arrived, even if the person you most wanted to share it with was not there to receive it. "I know," Sarah said. Dorothy was quiet for another moment. Then, "Tell Dr. Marsh I want to speak with her before the installation. I have things I want in the exhibition text. Things about what this place meant to the family, not just what it was architecturally. I'll tell her," Sarah said. She was in the truck when she made the call, parked at the end of Dorothy's street, having spent the afternoon at Dorothy's kitchen table sorting through the letters for the fourth time, building the annotated record the museum had requested, assigning dates and to each of Thomas Holt's accountings. She had gotten good at reading him. She had gotten good at the gaps, at what he didn't say but meant, at the specific weight of the entries where Mary's name appeared twice in a paragraph, which was the weight of a person, being careful not to say too much about how important another person was, because saying it directly felt like it might break something. She sat in the truck after the call and looked at Dorothy's house, at the light in the kitchen window, at the shape of a woman moving behind the glass. She was going to knock on that door again tomorrow. And Dorothy would pour coffee before Sarah had her jacket off, and they would work through the exhibition text and the questions the museum had sent about Thomas Holt's farming practices and the specific model of cast iron stove in the firebox. They would do that tomorrow and the day after that and the week after that. She had not understood before this that belonging somewhere was mostly made of ordinary days. Not the day you arrived, not the significant days, not the days where something decisive happened, the ordinary days. The Tuesday afternoons, the coffee before the jacket was off, the same table and the same cups and the shape of a person moving behind a kitchen window at dusk. She started the truck and drove home. The museum opening was on a Saturday in late September, 1 year and 11 days after the storm. The gallery had been arranged around the cabin itself, which had been disassembled timber by timber, transported, and reassembled by the Bozeman team, with the kind of attention to original placement that required both the specialists and approximately 12 hours of review of the documentation Sarah had helped compile over the previous months. Every plank was back in its original position. The stove was centered on its stone base. The bench was against the left wall with the drawer installed beneath it, empty and open so that visitors could see the mechanism and understand what had been hidden there, and what it meant that it had been hidden. On the wall above the stove, reproduced at the same scale, and in the same style as the original carving, were the instructions. Keep lower vent open during storms. Dry pine catches fastest. Check east pipe if smoke backs. And below them, in the same reproduction, still works. KH, the letters were in a climate-controlled display case to the right of the entrance. 29 letters, each open to a different page, each lit with the careful low light that paper required, each accompanied by a small card with a date and annotation that Sarah had written. The exhibition text was not long. The museum's director had asked for 300 words, because the cabin itself was the primary document, and the words were footnotes to the space. She had written it in one sitting at Dorothy's kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in August, and had not revised it once. 312 people came on opening day. Sarah stood at the back of the gallery for most of it. She was not the story. She understood this completely and without any particular effort, because the story was in the display case and on the wall, and in the specific quality of the space itself, which the museum had done something precise with, introducing a faint trace of pine resin into the air conditioning that was not intrusive but was present, a signal that said to the body before it said anything to the mind. This is a place that lived in a forest. An elderly man in a red flannel shirt read every letter in the case from beginning to end, moving at the pace of someone who was not skimming, who had decided at the entrance to give this his full attention, and was following through on that decision. When he reached the last letter, he stood with his hands behind his back and looked at the cabin for a long time. Then he turned and he was looking at Sarah across the room, and he said nothing, but he placed one hand briefly against his chest, and then turned back to the cabin. She didn't know him. She would never know what the letters had said to him specifically. That was between him and Thomas Holt. That was precisely how it was supposed to work. A school group arrived at 2 in the afternoon, 24th graders with the compressed energy of children, trying to behave in an indoor space that required it. Their teacher stopped them in front of the stove and explained how it worked, and a girl with red braids raised her hand and asked why someone would build their house out of a wagon. The teacher started to answer. The girl said, "Was it because they didn't have anywhere else to go?" The teacher paused. Kenneth, who had been standing near the exit for most of the afternoon, in the way that people stood in exits when they were not certain about rooms with this many people in them, said from behind the group, "That's exactly why. They didn't have anywhere else to go, so they made this instead." The girl thought about that for a moment, but then it became somewhere else to go, she said. For other people, Kenneth looked at her. "Yes," he said. It did. Sarah, watching from the back of the gallery, felt something move through her that had no single name. It was not a simple emotion. It was the compound feeling of a person standing somewhere they had earned, not by being born into it, but by walking toward it in a snowstorm in the dark, and recognizing straight lines when she saw them, and understanding what the obligation of finding something was. She thought about Thomas Holt writing to a stranger. She thought about what it required to do that. The willingness to believe the future was listening even without evidence that it was. The willingness to prepare the space and write the instructions, and leave the wood stacked and trust the rest to whatever came next. She thought about KH and Still Works, and the chain of people who had kept the thing in condition to be used. She was part of that chain now. That was not small. That was, in fact, the thing. Dorothy appeared at her elbow, sometime in the mid-afternoon, and stood beside her without saying anything for a while. Looking at the room the way Sarah was looking at it, taking in the people moving through the space that the two of them had spent months preparing to receive them. "Hector would have stood exactly where you're standing," Dorothy said. Finally, Sarah looked at her. Dorothy looked back with the direct, uncalculated attention that had been the first thing Sarah noticed about her at the kitchen table 9 months ago, and then she said, "You should come for Thanksgiving." Not, "You're welcome to come if you're free." Not, "We'd love to have you if you don't have other plans." Just the bare declarative, the form of the sentence that assumed yes before it asked. Sarah looked at her for a moment. She had spent 21 years learning not to assume she would be included, not to lean on continuity, not to make herself at home in spaces that would eventually stop being available. She had learned those things so thoroughly they had become structural, the load-bearing walls of how she moved through the world, and dismantling load-bearing walls required both intention and time. She was working on it. "Okay," she said. Dorothy nodded in the way of someone for whom this had already been decided, and the conversation was simply catching up. She turned back to the room. His phone never stopped ringing. Kenneth was still talking to the girl with the red braids, who had apparently moved on to questions about how the stove vent worked, which Kenneth was explaining with the patience of someone who thought the question was a good one. Sarah picked up a glass of water from the table near the entrance and went back to watching. The afternoon light came through the high windows at the angle that late September produced in Montana, long and golden and slightly retrospective, the kind of light that had something to say about time. It fell across the cabin's old timber walls and the display case, with the letters and the people moving between them, and it made the room look, for a moment, like something that had been there for a long time, which it had, in one form or another. For 133 years, Sarah stood in the back of the gallery and watched the light move. The night before Thanksgiving, she lay in her apartment and looked at the ceiling and thought about Thomas Holt, writing in the dark of a Montana winter in 1891, by whatever light he had, on the paper he had saved for the purpose. to a person he had never met, and could not imagine, and who would not arrive, for 133 years. She thought about what it required to do that. Not the writing itself, which was a physical act, and required only paper and a blade, and the willingness to sit down. The thing underneath the writing, the willingness to believe the future was listening without any evidence that it was. The willingness to prepare the space, and write the instructions, and stack the dry wood, and leave the letter in the drawer, and trust the decades to do what decades did with things that had been built carefully and maintained with intention. She had been thinking about this for a year now in the way she thought about things that had changed the shape of something keen fundamental, which was not in a concentrated, deliberate way, but continuously, in the background, the way a river thought about its bed. She was 22 years old. She lived in a studio apartment on the east side of Missoula, on the third floor of a building that had been there since the 50s. In 3 rooms and a bathroom with a window that faced west toward a mountain she could now identify by name. The shelf was still the 2 planks and the L brackets, but it had more on it now. The survival guides were still there. The trail atlas was still there. They had been joined by 3 books on Montana history, 2 on archival preservation methods, 1 on the specific conservation of 19th century paper documents, and a course packet from the community college program she had enrolled in 6 weeks after the museum opening, Montana History and Archival Research Methods. 2 courses, Tuesday and Thursday evenings, in a classroom at the west end of campus, with fluorescent lighting, and 30-year-old desks, and an instructor named Dr. Fowler, who had been teaching the same material for 20 years, and had not become bored with it, which was the most important qualification. She was not certain yet of the exact shape of what she was moving toward. She had stopped requiring that certainty. Certainty about the shape of a future was, she had come to understand, a way of protecting yourself from the future's actual character, which was that it arrived as it arrived, and not as you had planned it. What mattered was the direction. She knew the direction. She turned off the light and looked at the ceiling in the dark. Tomorrow she was going to Dorothy's for Thanksgiving. She was bringing a pie she had made herself from a recipe written on an index card in Dorothy's handwriting. A recipe for apple pie using dried apples reconstituted in warm cider, which was the closest approximation Dorothy had been able to reconstruct of what Mary Holt might have made in October 1891 with the ingredients available to her. Dorothy had handed her the card 3 weeks ago at the kitchen table with the particular straightforwardness of someone giving a gift that was also an inheritance and wanted the recipient to understand both things simultaneously. Sarah had made the pie that afternoon. It was cooling on the counter in the kitchen corner of her studio. The apartment smelled like cinnamon and cooked apple, and the specific warmth of a thing prepared in advance, for a day you were looking forward to. She noticed this. She noticed it the way she had been learning, over the past year, to notice things she had previously moved past too quickly to register. The smell of the pie, the index card in Dorothy's handwriting on the counter, beside the stove, the fact that she had spent 2 hours this afternoon, doing something that was entirely about tomorrow. About a table she had been invited to, about people who were expecting her and would notice if she didn't come. She lay in the dark and let herself feel the full weight of that without immediately moving past it. Then she closed her eyes and went to sleep. Thanksgiving morning arrived the way late November mornings arrived in Missoula, gray and cold, and entirely without apology for either of those qualities. The mountains to the east had their first permanent snow on the upper ridges, the white line that appeared in October and didn't leave until May, and the city below them had the particular quality it got in the cold months, quieter, more interior, people moving with the purposeful compactness of those who had spent enough winters in this climate to stop being surprised by it. Sarah was up early. She showered and dressed and stood at the kitchen counter, eating toast and looking out the window at the mountain while the coffee brewed. The pie was in its dish, covered in foil. The bottle of wine she'd asked Kenneth what to bring was on the counter beside it. She had written Dorothy's address in her notebook even though she had been to the house 9 times in the past year and knew the route without consulting anything. She was not nervous. She identified the thing she was feeling more precisely than nervous. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something that mattered, and knowing it mattered, and not being able to reduce it to a smaller size for easier handling. She had gotten better at not trying to reduce things to smaller sizes. That was one of the year's accomplishments. She loaded the pie and the wine into the truck, and drove across Missoula in the gray morning light. Dorothy's street was quiet. 2 cars in the driveway that Sarah didn't recognize, which meant Kenneth was there already, and someone else as well, which Dorothy had mentioned and which Sarah had registered and then set aside rather than building anxiety around. Dorothy had said there would be a few people. A few people was fine. A few people was the appropriate size for a first Thanksgiving in a place you were learning to be. She parked at the curb and sat for one breath with the engine off. She thought about the 7 front doors. She thought about the specific quality of those approaches, the social worker behind her or beside her, the bag of belongings that was never quite enough to fill a room, the particular held breath moment before things became whatever they were going to become. She had stood at 7 of those doors, and at none of them had she felt what she felt now, which was simply, I am expected here. I was invited by someone who wanted me to come. My place at this table has been set. She picked up the pie and the wine and got out of the truck. She was halfway up the front walk when the door opened. Dorothy stood in the threshold with the warm interior air of the house moving out past her into the cold gray morning, and the smell of it reached Sarah on the front walk before she reached the steps. Turkey and rosemary and old wood and coffee and the faint sweetness of something baking, and Dorothy looked at her on the walk with the expression of a woman who had been paying attention to the front window and had decided that the dignified thing was to open the door before her guest had to knock. There you are, Dorothy said. 2 words, the most ordinary 2 words available. The words you said to someone who had been briefly elsewhere and had returned to the place you were, who had arrived where you expected them to arrive, who had come through the door that was their door, because you had made it their door by the simple sustained act of leaving it open for them. Sarah stepped inside. The house was warm and full of the sounds of people who knew each other in the comfortable way, conversation from the kitchen and a football game at low volume, from somewhere deeper in the house, and Kenneth's voice saying something that made someone laugh. Dorothy took the pie and handed it to someone Sarah didn't know yet, a woman about Dorothy's age who introduced herself as Connie and disappeared, back into the kitchen with the pie, and a comment about how it smelled perfect. Sarah hung her jacket on the hook by the door that Dorothy indicated. She stood for a moment in the entryway and let the house arrange itself around her. The warmth, the sounds, the smell of the meal that had been in preparation since early morning, the evidence everywhere of a place that had been lived in and loved and maintained across a long time by people who understood that a house was not a container for living, but a participant in it. Come on, Dorothy said, and Anne led her into the kitchen where Connie was checking something in the oven, and Kenneth was cutting bread at the counter, and a man Sarah didn't know was opening a bottle of wine at the kitchen table, and all of them looked up when she came in, and none of the looks were the looks she had spent 21 years navigating, the assessing looks, the category assignment looks, the looks that were deciding before they had any information. These were the looks of people who had been told about her and were glad she was here. She sat down at the kitchen table, and someone put a glass of wine in front of her, and Connie asked her a question about the museum, and she answered it. And the conversation moved forward in the natural way of conversations, among people who were comfortable with each other. And Sarah was inside the conversation rather than adjacent to it, and that distinction was not small. It was, in fact, the entire thing. Dinner was at 2 o'clock, at a table extended with a leaf. Dorothy brought up from the basement and covered with a cloth that had been in the family long enough to have been repaired in 2 places, with thread that almost matched. 8 people around the table, Dorothy at the head, Kenneth to her left, Connie beside him, the man with the wine who was Connie's husband Robert, 2 of Kenneth's colleagues from the DNRC, whose names were Gary and Lynn, a woman named Pamela, who had been Dorothy's friend since before Hector died, and who had the specific warmth of someone who had decided a long time ago that life was too short for anything less than directness. And Sarah. The food was the food of a table assembled by people who each brought something. Dorothy's turkey and the gravy she'd been making the same way for 40 years. Connie's sweet potatoes, Robert's rolls, Pamela's green bean dish that she explained was her mother's recipe, and then declined to share the recipe on the grounds that some things needed to remain rare, which made Kenneth laugh. Sraz pie was on the counter for later. The conversation moved the way. Conversation moved at tables, where people were genuinely comfortable with each other, which was not in a single line but in the branching way, 2 or 3 things going at once. Someone picking up a thread that had been set down 10 minutes ago, laughter arriving from unexpected angles. Sarah spoke when she had something to contribute and listened when she didn't. And no one checked on her. No one made the particular social adjustment of including someone who needed to be included, because she didn't need to be included in that managed way. She was just there. At some point Pamela asked her how she'd found the cabin, and Sarah gave the version she'd gotten better at over the past year, which was shorter and better paced than the original, and ended with the fire catching on the third strike, rather than trailing off into reflection. The table was quiet for a moment after she finished. Gary, the DNRC colleague, said, "And the stove still worked." "Still worked," Sarah confirmed. He shook his head in the slow way of someone genuinely impressed by a material fact. 130 years, he said. Dorothy looked at Sarah from the head of the table, with the expression Sarah had come to know over the past year, the one that was not quite a smile, and not quite something more serious, but held both possibilities equally. "Good construction and good maintenance," Dorothy said. "That's all it ever is." The table moved on. Someone asked Kenneth about conditions on the Cascade Trails for winter hiking, and he gave his professional opinion, and the conversation branched again. Sarah ate her dinner and drank her wine and looked around the table at the people at it, and thought about what it had cost to make this. Not this meal, specifically, though the meal had cost something. The table itself. The particular human configuration of it, the accumulation of relationships and years, and the small daily decisions that had built, incrementally and without drama, a life that had room in it for a 22-year-old woman who had shown up at Dorothy's door a year ago with a canvas bundle in her pack, and a question she hadn't known how to ask until the asking became unavoidable. She thought about Mary Holt's dried apples. She thought about the months of small daily acts that had made the pie possible. She thought about what it meant to save something up for a day you intended to celebrate before that day arrived. The pie, when Dorothy brought it out after dinner, was good. Pamela said so emphatically and asked for the recipe, and Dorothy said she'd gotten it from Sarah, and Pamela turned to Sarah with an expression of recalibration. "It's a reconstruction," Sarah said, "of what Mary Holt might have made. Dried apples and warm cider." Pamela looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the pie. Then she took another piece. "That's the right way to honor something," she said. "You make it again." Sarah held that sentence for a moment after Pamela moved on to other conversation. She held it the way she held things that mattered, without trying to resolve them into something smaller and more manageable. Just held it and let it sit with its full weight. You make it again. Not you preserve it. Not you document it. Not you put it in a case with proper lighting and archival quality labels, though all of those things had their place. You make it again. You find the ingredients available to you, and you do the thing the original thing did, which was to take what you had and make it into something that said, "This day mattered. This person mattered. I thought about this before it arrived, and I prepared for it." She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Winter in Missoula moved the way. Winters moved in mountain towns, which was to say that it arrived with authority and stayed past the point where it had made its point, and the city adjusted to it with the practiced resignation of a place that had stopped being surprised by weather a very long time ago. Sarah spent the winter evenings at the community college 2 nights a week, in Dr. Fowler's classroom, with its 30-year-old desks and its fluorescent lighting and its succession of topics that had started with pre-territorial Montana and were working their way forward through the decades with the methodical satisfaction of a subject that had more material than it could ever fully cover. She sat in the second row from the front and took notes by hand because she had read that handwriting produced better retention than typing, and she was investing in retention. She asked questions when she had them, which was often, and Dr. Fowler had the quality of a teacher who found questions from students who had actual reasons for asking them to be the best part of the work. On Tuesday afternoons before the evening class, she went to the museum. Not because it was required, because it was where she wanted to be. She had been given a part-time administrative position in the archives 2 months after the opening, 2 days a week at first and then 3, organizing the documentation from the Holt Cabin project into the museum's permanent collection system, which was a task that was both more technically demanding and more personally significant than she had anticipated. Technically demanding because archival organization required a precision she was still developing, a systematic approach to description and indexing that left no room for approximation. Personally significant because every document she processed was one she had already read in other contexts. Read at Dorothy's kitchen table, or in the cabin by headlamp, or in the truck on nights, when she needed to hold something that had already proven it could endure. She processed the letters with the specific care of someone who understood that she was the last person who would handle them as personal objects rather than historical ones. After the processing, they would be accessible, appropriately, to researchers and visitors, and the future in general, which was what they deserved. But she was the last person for whom they were also, specifically, the stack of papers she'd found in a drawer in a snowstorm on her 21st birthday. She handled them accordingly. Dr. Marsh came back to Missoula in January for a follow-up consultation and took Sarah to coffee at a place on the river that had been there since the 90s. "You're good at this," Marsh said, meaning the archival work, the way Sarah had approached the documentation project. "I had good material to work with," Sarah said. Marsh looked at her over her coffee cup. "That's part of it. But you have the instinct for it. You know what things mean, not just what they say." Sarah thought about that later, on the walk back to the museum in the January cold. The distinction Marsh had made, what things say versus what things mean. The gap between those two was where everything important lived. The letters said, "Snow came early. Roof held. Clara was scared." What they meant was something larger, and more human, and more necessary. The thing that had made a 67-year-old woman press her palm flat against a piece of paper, as if confirming its reality. The thing that had made an elderly man in a red flannel shirt stand with his hand against his chest in a gallery. The thing that had made Sarah cry in a snowstorm alone, in a room that had been waiting for exactly as long as it needed to wait. She knew what things meant. She didn't entirely know how she knew, or where the knowing had come from, whether it was innate, or whether it was the specific education of a life spent paying close attention to the way people left evidence of themselves in the spaces they occupied. Because when you moved through 7 homes in 18 years, you became very skilled at reading the residue of people who had lived somewhere before you arrived. That might be it, the particular usefulness of a particular history. She had not thought about her history that way before. She walked back to the museum in the January cold and thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. Spring came to Montana the way it always came, not as an arrival but as a series of negotiations with the winter that had been there before it. Small advances and retreats over weeks until one morning you woke up, and the air through the open windows smelled different, and you understood that the balance had shifted for good. Sarah was sitting at Dorothy's kitchen table on the morning. She understood that the balance had shifted in other ways as well. It was a Tuesday in April. She had her course materials spread across one half of the table, and Dorothy's correspondence about the museum's plans for a traveling version of the Holt Cabin exhibition spread across the other half, and they had been working in companionable parallel for 2 hours in the way they worked when they were both busy with their own things, but preferred to be busy in the same room. And Dorothy had refilled the coffee once without asking, which was a thing Dorothy did when she had decided you were staying a while. Sarah looked up from the document she was reading and looked at Dorothy, who was writing something with the focused quality she brought to written communication, the quality of someone who chose words with the understanding that they were consequentials. She looked at Dorothy's kitchen. At the table she had sat at more times in the past year and a half than she could count. At the marks on the doorframe where Dorothy had recorded Kenneth's height as a child, the dates still written in pencil beside each line. At the photograph on the refrigerator of Hector as a young man standing in a field somewhere, squinting into the sun with an expression that was recognizably his son's expression. At the hook by the back door where Sarah's jacket hung beside Dorothy's jacket, which was where it had ended up the 3rd time she came for dinner and where it had lived since then by unspoken mutual agreement. She had a key to this house. Dorothy had given it to her in February, presented in the same matter-of-fact manner. Dorothy presented most things with the explanation that it was useful for Sarah to be able to drop things off when Dorothy wasn't home, which was true and was also not the only reason. She had a drawer in the guest room, not her room, not yet, but a drawer that was reliably hers, that held a spare set of clothes and the phone charger she kept forgetting, and a paperback she'd been reading in installments over several visits. She had a standing invitation to Sunday dinner that had never been explicitly issued as a standing invitation, but had simply become one through the accumulation of consecutive Sundays on which it had been assumed she would come. She looked at all of this. She thought about what she had understood belonging to mean before this year. She had understood it as something you were born into or formally assigned to, something that came with paperwork or biology, something that was either present from the beginning or absent. She had understood it as categorical. You either had it or you didn't. She had been wrong about that, or not wrong exactly, incomplete. She had been working from an incomplete definition that was based entirely on the evidence available to her at the time, which was the evidence of 7 foster homes, and the specific ways belonging had been attempted and had not quite arrived. She had taken that evidence and drawn the most reasonable conclusion available from it, which was that belonging was something other people had access to, and she did not. The evidence she had now was different. She looked at Dorothy writing at the other end of the table. She thought about Thomas Holt and his letter to the future. His willingness to write to a stranger and trust the stranger to understand. She thought about the chain of people who had tended the cabin, who had oiled the hinges and stacked the dry wood and left the instructions and the confirmation. She thought about KH and still works, and the specific faith embedded in those 2 words, the faith that said, "I was here and I made sure it was ready, and whoever you are, you can trust it," she thought. This is what that looks like from the inside. She returned to her document. Dorothy, without looking up from what she was writing, said, "The Bozeman Preservation Team wants to do a second site assessment before the traveling exhibition opens. Marsh says they need someone who knows the terrain." Sora looked up. "Kenneth has the week of the 15th blocked," Dorothy said. "He asked if you were available." She looked at the course calendar in her head. The 15th was a Thursday. She had class Tuesday and Thursday evenings, but the daytime was open. "I'm available," she said. Dorothy made a note. "Good," she said, and went back to her letter. Sarah went back to her document. Outside the kitchen window, the April light was doing what April light did in Montana, arriving at an angle that was lower than summer and higher than winter, and specific to this month, particular to this season, the light of a year that had turned a corner and knew it. She graduated from the community college program on a Thursday evening in May, in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and the particular optimism of institutional ceremonies, with 43 other people who had completed the historic preservation certificate requirements and were being handed their certificates by the program director in the particular handshake and smile choreography of every graduation Sarah had ever seen in photographs, because she had never attended one as a participant before. Dorothy was in the 3rd row with Kenneth beside her, and Pamela on the other side of Kenneth, and Connie and Robert in the row behind them, which was four more people than Sarah had expected, and which she discovered when she came through the door with the other graduates and looked into the audience in the reflexive way, and found Dorothy's face immediately, because Dorothy had the quality of a person who was easy to find in a room. She received her certificate and shook the program director's hand, and walked back to her seat and looked at the document in her hands, Certificate in Historic Preservation. Sarah Mitchell, the date in May. The college's seal in the corner. She had never had a document with her name on it that she had earned rather than been assigned. The birth certificate she'd never seen, the foster care paperwork that had followed her from home to home, the ID cards and social security documentation, all of it had been given to her as a consequence of existing rather than as a consequence of doing something. This was different. This had her name on it because she had gone to class on Tuesday and Thursday evenings for 8 months, and had done the work and had learned the things, and had demonstrated the learning, and the institution had looked at that and said, "Yes, this is something you did, and here is the record of it." She held the certificate for the rest of the ceremony and looked at it periodically, Nander. After the ceremony, Dorothy took everyone to dinner at the place on the river that had been there since the 90s, the same place Marsh had taken Sarah for coffee in January, which felt like a rightness, the way certain places accumulated meaning through repeated use. They took up a long table in the back room and ordered too much food, and talked about the graduation and about the traveling exhibition, which was scheduled to open in Billings in the fall, and about Kenneth's plans to formalize the access trail to the cabin site, now that it was part of the historical record, and about Pamela's theory that the girl with the red braids from the school group on opening day was going to grow up to be a historian, which Kenneth thought was a reasonable projection based on the quality of her follow-up questions about the stove vent. Sarah sat in the middle of the conversation and ate her dinner, and said things when there were things to say, and listened to sense when there wasn't. And the evening moved in the way evenings moved at tables where people were comfortable with each other, which was not toward a conclusion but simply forward. One thing leading to another, the meal and the conversation and the occasion weaving together into something that was more than any of its components. Later, when the table had been cleared, and the check had been negotiated in the particular friendly dispute of people who all wanted to pay for different things, Dorothy touched Sarah's arm and said, quietly, not for the whole table. Hector would have been very pleased. Sarah looked at her. She had been thinking about that all evening, without knowing she was thinking about it. About Hector Holt, who had spent his adult life looking for the letters his grandmother Clara had told him about, who had walked every trail he could find in the Cascade Ridge area and never found the cabin, who had died in 2003 without knowing that the thing he'd been looking for was there and intact and waiting in a sealed drawer under a bench, with a fire kit on the wall and stacked dry wood, and a letter from his great-great-grandfather, addressed to whoever came next. She thought about what it meant to spend a life looking for something without finding it, and whether this looking was diminished by the not finding. She had thought about this question in various forms over the past year and a half, and had arrived, gradually and without complete certainty, at the answer that it was not. That what Hector had done by looking, by taking the story his grandmother told him seriously enough to follow it into the mountains repeatedly over decades, was its own kind of tending. He had kept the story alive. He had told it to Kenneth. Kenneth had kept the cabin in condition, and so the chain had held until she had walked into the storm on October 14th and seen straight lines in the dark and understood what they meant. The chain had held because everyone in it had done their part. That was enough. That had always been enough. Thomas Holt had said so. Build something that lasts, not for yourself, for the person who comes after you. He had not specified that you needed to see the result. The building was the thing. The maintaining was the thing. The leaving of instructions and the stacking of dry wood and the oiling of hinges and the writing of letters to strangers you would never meet. She looked at Dorothy. Thank you, she said. And meant it with the full specific weight of everything it was thanking, which was not only this evening and this dinner and the graduation ceremony and the people in the third row, but the year and the kitchen table and the coffee before the jacket was off and the key in the drawer and the Sunday dinners and the index card with the recipe for dried apple pie and the 2 words at the door on Thanksgiving morning that had said, without qualification or condition, there you are. Dorothy looked at her in the direct, uncalculated way. You did this, she said. Sarah looked at her for a moment. We both did, she said. Dorothy considered that. Then she nodded in the way of someone accepting a correction that was also true. They walked out of the restaurant into the May evening, which was cool and clear, the kind of evening that came in Montana after a long winter when the air had finally decided to stop threatening and simply be pleasant, and the group dispersed in the particular friendly chaos of people who had their own cars and their own directions, but were in no particular hurry to reach them. Sarah drove home through the quiet May streets with the certificate on the passenger seat, and the window cracked, the cool air moving through the truck in the specific way that moving air moved through a space that was familiar. That was hers. That was the space she was returning to, rather than simply the space she was going to next. She parked in front of her building and sat for a moment with the engine off. She thought about October 14th. She thought about the parking lot of the Sinclair station in the dark before dawn, and the phone screen with its absence of notifications, and the practiced lie she had given Beverly about friends who didn't exist. She thought about driving north, because the mountains were north, and the mountains had never made her feel like a problem requiring a solution. She thought about straight lines in a storm and a door that felt like it had already decided. She thought about Thomas Holt sitting in this cabin in October 1891, by whatever light he had, writing to a person he couldn't picture and couldn't name, saying, I don't know who you are, but I know you needed this place, and I know the hardest winters are the ones you go through alone, and I know what I'm supposed to do with that knowledge, which is this. Build something that lasts, not for yourself, for the person who comes after you. She picked up the certificate from the passenger seat and looked at her name on it. Then she got out of the truck and went upstairs. The apartment smelled like the candle she'd left burning on the kitchen counter, pine and something warmer underneath it, and the window she'd left, cracked in the bedroom let in the May air, and the shelf with the survival guides and the trail atlas and the history books and the preservation manuals was where it always was, and the mountain was visible through the west window. In the last of the evening light, the upper ridges still carrying their winter snow, the lower slopes already green. She put the certificate on the shelf. She looked at it for a moment, at her name on it, at the date in May, at the seal in the corner. Then she made a cup of tea and sat at the table by the window and looked at the mountain until the light was gone, and the mountain was only a darker shape against a dark sky, and the city around her made its small sounds. And she was in a place she knew, in a life she had built from what she had, which was what Thomas Holt had done, and what Mary Holt had done, and what everyone in any chain of tending had always done, which was to take what was available and make something of it that would still be there for the person who came after. The tea went cool. She didn't move to reheat it. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Outside, the mountain stood the way it had always stood, the way it would stand long after all of them were gone, patient and permanent and entirely indifferent to the question of whether anyone was paying attention to it, because mountains did not require an audience to do the thing they did, which was simply to be there, available, when someone who needed to see straight lines in the dark looked left at exactly the right moment. She looked at it anyway. It was enough to look. It had always been enough. Thomas Holt had known that. He had written it down so the next person would know it too. Some things a person learned before they knew what they were learning. Some doors opened before you knocked. Some things lasted not because they were built to last, but because enough people, across enough time, understood that their part of the chain was to make sure the next person had what they needed. Sarah Mitchell had been the next person once. She was now the person before, and somewhere out there, on a mountain she could see from her window. On clear days, a cabin stood in a grove of old ponderosa, accessible now by a marked trail that Kenneth had cleared and signed in the spring, its door on proper hinges, its stove documented and assessed and declared safe for demonstration use, its walls carrying the carved instructions of a man who had understood 130 years ago that the only thing worth building was something you built for a stranger. The cabin was still ready. It was still, in all the ways that mattered, waiting to do what it had always done, which was to be there when someone who needed it looked left at exactly the right moment, and saw straight lines in the dark and understood that straight lines meant someone had been there before them, and had thought about what they would need, and had left it ready. That was the chain. That was all it had ever been. Sarah turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and the mountain outside her window stood in the dark, without requiring anything from anyone, and the city made its small sounds, and somewhere 133 years of careful tending rested quietly in a museum gallery, with proper lighting and archival quality labels, and a piece of paper beside the stove that said, in letters that had been read by 312 people on a Saturday in September, and would be read by however many thousands more in the years to come. Still works.